of what we do and some of the ramifications of the work that we've been doing. And so in essence, I think, you know, the longer I stay in ecology, the more I think it's energy that's really the thing that we have to understand about organisms. They're just simply energy in, energy out, and that tells us everything we need to know. So for this talk, I'm just going to give some context, some touching on ecology and evolution of the species, because I don't think everybody knows where polar bears live and how they live and some of the key factors that influence their life history. And then I'm going to touch on some of the ecosystem linkages and dynamics. And then I'm going to, at the tail end, that's the part with graphs that will just put some of the studies that we've been working on in just the last few years into context. It's impossible to go over everything. And I sort of debated about how much detail to put in. So this is a very young version of DeRocher. This is going back to 1984. And I'm a product of our department, or at least an earlier iteration thereof, the Department of Zoology. So I was originally from Vancouver. I came to the University of Alberta, did my master's working with Dr. Ian Sterling, of course, who many of you know, and Dr. Sue Hannon. And I stuck around so long that I ended up staying for a PhD also on polar bears. So you start to get the sense that maybe I'm a bit of a one-trick pony. In the mid-90s, 1996, I moved to Norway and ran their polar bear program for 7 years. So, you know, the locations changed, the bears don't. I seem to change, which is kind of scary. 2004, a couple of years after I joined the department here, still had some hair and not much gray in that beard, but over years, again, different places across the Arctic, and I just seem to get less hair and more gray. I think I've learned a few things about polar bears over that time. So we're going to go through some things about polar bears, ecology and evolution, and put it into context, where this species came from and where they might be going in the future and what some of the challenges for them are in a conservation perspective under a changing Arctic. So this is the ancestral polar bear. Most of us know this as Ursus arctos or grizzly bear, brown bear. It's a brown terrestrial omnivore. This species has a huge range geographically, and of course, historically found as far south as Mexico and as north as the Arctic Circle in the North American context, but also are still found in the Gobi Desert and other places. But over a time period from somewhere around 500,000 years to 5 million years, they shifted to become a white marine carnivore. And so during this process, of course, they have shifted their habitat dramatically. This is a species of the north, and it's associated with the presence of sea ice. Now, a lot of changes have occurred in the species over this time. They can still hybridize, and we did have some recent hybrids in the wild just in the last decade or so in the Canadian Arctic. It turns out it was just kind of an unusual event. But there are lots of anatomical, behavioral, physiological changes that have occurred over time as polar bears separated from grizzly bears. And some of them, I won't go into them at all. If you want to know more, you can take my mammalogy class, Biology 408. But one of the things that happened is the dentition has changed. Polar bears are moving back to a more carnivorous state on their teeth rather than the more omnivorous teeth, the molars in particular of the grizzly bear. The skull in a polar bear is more elongated, probably tied to air warming and olfaction. And then there's other changes. Also, their eyes are a little bit higher up on the skull, which may facilitate swimming in water more frequently. So again, there are some structural changes in bone strength. Polar bears actually have a less strong skull than do grizzly bears. And that's because they really don't have to do much with those teeth in terms of processing. They rip off chunks of food and swallow them whole. Again, differences on the base of the bear. Grizzly bear foot, those claws are really designed for excavation, digging up roots, small mammals, whereas a polar bear has these much more predatory claws that are designed for grasping prey and also providing traction on slippery surfaces like ice. Of course, the hair on a polar bear's foot provides additional warmth. They tend to have very broad feet as well, which provides them additional support, reduces foot loading when we're walking across broken surfaces. So again, one of the things you don't see here in these figures is the fact that these bears, despite polar bears and grizzly bears living right next to each other in the Arctic, they live almost opposite lifestyles. So polar bears are active during the winter, but if you went up to the Arctic right now, you cannot find a grizzly bear anywhere. Why? Because they're all hibernating. They're in the ground. They'll come out in the spring and start feeding on whatever they can find in their environment, but they live a very different lifestyle. Polar bears, in the contrast in the summer, are chilling, living off their fat reserves that they've accumulated in the winter and spring. So vastly different species. Polar bears have a smaller litter size than do grizzly bears, usually 1 or 2 cubs, sometimes triplets. But some of the evolutionary shifts that have occurred is that polar bears only have 4 functional mammae, whereas most grizzly bears have 6 functional mammae. So again, reflecting this 2-to-1 pattern that we commonly see in the number of mammae versus litter size. So again, the cubs are born very altricial, less than 1 kilogram at birth. And then at this stage, they're about 10 kilos and are heading back out to the ice. There's a long period of association between the mother and her offspring. It's about 2.5 years, and the cubs are actually weaning through that time period. One of the consequences of this long association is that there's a slow population growth rate. Somewhere around 4 to 5% would be a normal growth rate in a polar bear population. One thing in this female's actually got cubs that are just coming up to their 2nd birthday. And it's kind of interesting. You can actually, this is in Churchill near Manitoba, you can actually have a mother nursing a cub that's actually larger than she is, particularly if it's a male offspring and a single one at that. This picture is pretty good because it shows a satellite collar on this female. That's a major part of our research in the Hudson Bay system now, and actually pretty much everywhere we've studied bears. It's kind of the fundament of how we understand where they live, because these animals move over such large spaces. Following individuals over time is really critical. And I'll show just a little bit of some of the work that we've done from that data. These bears have a long lifespan, out to about 24 years for an adult male. That's sort of like this guy, he'd be in his early 20s. And adult females can live out to about 28 years. So again, K-selected species hovering around some sort of carrying capacity. The Arctic ecosystems are inherently dynamic with really good years and bad years. And we'll look at some of those challenges going forward for the bears about what do bad years mean in particular. I mean, this guy's really on the way out. You can look at his body condition. You can see his hips. I mean, nobody would buy a horse that looked like anything like that, but you get the idea. There's issues. From a habitat perspective, sea ice is where polar bears live. It's the surface over which they travel, where they hunt, where they mate, and we get some maternity denning in parts of their Arctic distribution. So if you were to go to Alaska in particular, we get a fair bit of maternity denning. We've got bears that were born on the sea ice, live their entire life on the sea ice, and die out there. They would never have to come to land. Now, of course, in lots of areas of their distribution, polar bears are forced ashore in the ice freeze season in summer. And so parts of their lower latitude distribution, like Western Hudson Bay and Southern Hudson Bay, the bears all come ashore in the summer and then go back out on the ice in late autumn, early winter. This is right on the western edge of the Northwest Passage. If you keep going here and keep going far enough, you'd actually, in that direction, you'd be in Russia, or you got to get across Arctic waters of Alaska first. But this is Prince Patrick Island in the Northwest Territories, where we were doing some work. We're going to talk a little bit about ice, not very much, but this is what we call fast ice. It's attached to land. It's a really stable platform. And just later on, when we look at one study in particular, you'll see that what type of ice the bears are selecting actually has certain ramifications for feeding and risks associated with different habitats. So this is in the Beaufort Sea. This is just on the edge of the landfast ice and moving out into somewhat more active ice in the pack. So there's drifting. So we get these openings called leads in the ice. Really important for polar bear habitat. I remember taking this picture because I think it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, about 3 days after a big storm. And you don't wait in the Arctic for sunrise to come up in May because the sun never sets. So it's, again, an interesting part of the world to work in. More recently, we've been working in the pack ice of Hudson Bay, which is a much more challenging environment. The ice is much more fractured. It's much more labile, drifting. This is in the active zone between the landfast ice and then further offshore, the pack ice. A tough place to live and a tough place for polar bear researchers to make a living as well. But it's a neat study area. So where do polar bears live? Well, we know they're a northern species. This is just an illustration of their distribution on the broad scale, looking from the pole down. And one of the things that's of interest here is that there are areas of high density. This is the preferred habitat, these darker purple areas. And so what we've got going here is, where are those areas? Over the continental shelves. Why? Because biological productivity is higher. So this is one of the challenges in a warming climate for polar bears, is that for a lot of species, as the climate warms, in an latitudinal context, we expect them to move northward. That's not a real possibility for polar bears because their preferred habitats are over waters less than 200 meters deep. But once you get outside of those sort of dark purple areas, we're now into deep waters and the Arctic Ocean basin, where the water depths are over 2,000 feet. Primary productivity is much lower, and the availability of prey drops precipitously as well. Another thing to consider when we talk about climate change and polar bears is it's not a one size fits all. We actually have 19 populations, and I'll show a map shortly. But one of the things to consider is we do have bears living right up quite close to the North Pole, like northern Greenland, northern Canada, but as well right down to James Bay and the southern parts of Labrador. So at the same latitude, basically, as London, England. So we've got this huge range, and as we'll see, the conditions that the bears live under are quite different over this range. So to put some things in context from a sea ice perspective, this is what the sea ice looked like in September of 1984. This is the first year that I was studying polar bears. And one of the things you can see is that at the maximum melt, so this is the minimum amount of ice that we're going to get in this year, you can see that off of the coast of Alaska and Western Canada, the sea ice is right along the shore. So in those years, if you were standing on the coast of Canada, you could see ice right offshore, and there were polar bears there. So it's a very different scenario. And the important thing in this area, and we've done a lot of work in the Canadian Beaufort Sea over the years, and one of the things that's really important is we have a very narrow continental shelf in that area. It only extends about 50 kilometers offshore. So that's really where the seals are. That's where the bears want to be. Now, if we fast forward to the worst ice conditions that we've had in the Arctic, which was in 2012, we see a vastly different scenario. And since 2012, we've had our worst 10 years of sea ice at the minimum, like in September, on record, for the satellite record anyways. So what does it mean to be a polar bear in this environment? So the rules have changed because the sea ice has changed. And bears have two options, and we see both of them in this population. Where historically bears did not come onto land in summer, we now see upwards of 30 to 60% in some years of the population coming onto land, mainly in Alaska, but sometimes on the coast of Canada as well. The other part of the population is forced to move northward with the retreating ice. And you don't see the scale bar on this graph, but that distance from Alaska up to that ice edge, it's about 1,000 kilometers straight line distance. So what we're asking in essence is for bears now to move in a straight line at least 2,000 kilometers round trip if they're going to stay with the ice in summer. We know they don't kill many seals up there in the summer now because the ice just doesn't have many seals using that as a platform anymore. So the system has changed fundamentally over time. So these are the 19 populations of polar bears across the Arctic, largely determined through movement data, satellite telemetry. I've worked in a number of them. Right now, our major study is in Western Hudson Bay. That population, we work very closely with Environment and Climate Change Canada on studies in that area. But we're also working in Davis Strait, and I've worked in many of these other areas. But again, to reiterate this idea that, you know, when people talk about polar bears, some of the climate change deniers want to say, well, there's more polar bears now than there were in the 1950s and 60s. Well, number one, we don't know how many polar bears there were in the 50s and 60s, so that's a non-starter. The second problem is that we know that polar bears were reduced in abundance in that time because we had commercial harvest and unregulated exploitation. So they did recover, but now the concern going forward is that climate change is the major threat. So what is the major threat? And probably if you don't get much more out of this talk than this, it's simply a habitat loss issue. So this is the trend in sea ice loss in days per decade in the different populations. And we can see in Hudson Bay, it's 6 to 12 days per decade that we're losing ice cover. And we're going to see why that matters more. The other population that I was working in when I worked in Norway is that one in purple. That's losing more than 30 days of sea ice per decade. A lot of my study area in that population no longer exists as polar bear habitat. The bears just can't get there anymore. So again, it's not a one size fits all because we've had historic loss as well. So this is the trend going back to 1979. So the other thing you have to think about is we've got several decades of existing ice loss, and these trends are not slowing down into the future. So polar bears have really adapted to persist where, or live where sea ice persists for most of the year, or at least a sufficient amount of time. And again, probably the core research question in my research group right now, it sounds pretty trivial, but what do you mean by sufficient? And we've done a lot of work on this topic. I would say a lot of our really influential work has been done in collaboration with Mark Lewis's lab, where we brought in a lot of mathematical biology into answering these questions. And so we've had several co-supervised students and continue to have some that are looking at these sorts of questions. And most of the time we get to at least an element of the energetic aspects in our studies. So now we're going to step back a bit, because I think not everybody knows how Arctic ecosystems work. And most of us in Alberta are pretty familiar with frozen water systems, but they may be freshwater systems. And they're vastly different in their structure than a marine ecosystem with sea ice. The reason is, when ice freezes, it actually ejects salt. It's a process called brines formation. So it ejects the salt from the ice. And as it does that, it creates these little micro channels in the sea ice itself. And that is the structure that makes Arctic ecosystems tick. It's basically a whole community of fungi, bacteria, and then algae inside the ice in these microchannels, tubules. And then it goes right up to the amphipods and copepods that then feed into those little fish, which are Borregatus seta, or polar cod, this ugly little fish. In this ecosystem, that's probably the keystone. Those fish are what make the link between this level and the prey of polar bears. So it's a simple system, but it's incredibly important. And the way I think about it and present it to people is that sea ice is like soil in a terrestrial ecosystem. If you take away the soil, of course, you can't grow back the forest or whatever you had there. And similarly, you take away the sea ice, you'll have another ecosystem that won't look like the one that was there before. So some studies from some colleagues, they looked at ice markers in phytoplankton, and they determined that it's between 72 and 100% of the diet is coming from this ice-associated or sympagic algae. So that's the energy. That's what drives this system. So this is a late spring photo showing the ice-associated algae growing on the bottom. You go through these areas with an icebreaker, which I've done a lot, mainly in the Norwegian Arctic. You just turn over. It looks like salad on the bottom of this. And of course, that's the base of this food chain. Wonderful diversity of invertebrates in these areas. This is just a small sampling. It's been really interesting to be out on these multidisciplinary cruises. I think in another lifetime, I would have probably come back and studied some of these organisms. You don't need as many scientific permits nor the logistic headaches. Well, maybe there's headaches, but still. And so in this food chain, though, polar cod eggs are really dependent on the sea ice to develop successfully. So this is the keystone species in this area. And a lot of work has been done on this. Some of this work was actually done at the U of A under Bill Tawn in days gone by. But it's quite clear that this is a species that's also vulnerable in this system because it feeds in to the prey of polar bears. So this is what I call the small meal deal and the big meal deal for polar bears. These are the two prey, and across the circumpolar Arctic, this is the bread and butter of what polar bears eat. The ring seals are up to about 70 kilos in body mass. There's millions across the Arctic of these. They're hugely abundant. Bearded seals, less abundant, but much larger, up to over 400 kilos. And again, one of the problems for polar bears and this whole ecosystem is that both of these seals are dependent on the presence of sea ice in order to carry out their life cycle. They rely on the ice to give birth to their pups. Ring seals do it in snow caves or layers on top of the ice. Bearded seals give birth to pups right on the edge of the ice. And again, without that ice, they can't reproduce. And so their distribution is also tied to the presence of sea ice. You have to have the ice or there's no seals. So it's a pretty simple sort of question looking at this ecosystem when they have such high reliance on seals. Nothing better from a polar bear perspective or as a biologist. I mean, I love seeing dead seals. And of course, this is what I call the banana effect. Polar bears they kill a seal. This is a young pup. It's not very fat, but what they do is they peel them open like a banana and they want to eat that layer of blubber underneath. A happy bear here. And so for the bird people in the crowd, of course, it's an ivory gull in the back and a glaucous gull. Actually, when we're out looking for bears, quite often we're looking for birds rather than bears. If the birds are there, there's a bear around somewhere. But a pretty happy bear here ripping apart a seal. This is a classic ring seal. I know the bear that killed this one. It was a big male in the spring. It was mating season, caught the seal, had a quick snack on it, and then took off looking for love rather than trying to eat more of this seal. But the neat thing here is this is what I call the Oreo cookie effect for a bear. They really want not the side of the seal that's down there in the muscle, nor really the skin. They peel them open and they're stripping out that icing, which of course is the blubber layer. So an incredibly energy-rich diet, and that's what makes it possible to be a polar bear. I consider them sort of like a fat vacuum. They go around, kill a seal, suck off the fat, and then move on, find another one, do the same thing. They rarely cache their prey. They don't stay with them. They tend to move on and leave them after a feeding. So it's quite a different system than brown bears, which if they do get a kill, tend to cache them and stay there. So again, in the context of how they make a living, a bear can eat about 10 to 20% of its weight in a single meal. So if we have a 500 kilogram adult male polar bear, which is not exceptionally large, but a good sized one, 50 to 100 kilos of seal fat in a single meal. And for context, not very scientific, but it's about 1,000 Big Mac meals you could buy at your local McDonald's. So that's kind of gives it into perspective. But to add context here, the assimilation efficiency of eating fat by a polar bear is about 94%. Eat 100 kilos of fat, that bear will actually assimilate about 94 kilos of it into their own adipocytes. So they just balloon. So you don't have to eat often. And one of the catches for the bears is that most of the feeding is the spring. So it's a narrow window of time. And so this is, when we look at bears, we tend to class them on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of their fatness. And really for polar bears, it is the survival of the fattest. We have very many studies across the Arctic showing that body condition is a major determinant of survival and also of reproductive success, particularly for pregnant females. So the bears at the top there, she'd be a 5 out of 5. She's almost certainly a pregnant female, ready and in good enough condition to go into a den. Now in Western Hudson Bay, a female like that can go up to 8 months without feeding at all and having a very controlled fast during that period of time, maintaining bone mass and most of her muscle mass. I won't go into the details, but some pretty tricky physiology going on for these bears. And at the same time, giving birth to and nursing her offspring up until she can go back out and feed again. Now, you say, okay, well, 8 months without food, that's pretty cool. So is that the fasting limitation? The problem for a lot of other bears is they don't get as fat. They're either not as skilled at hunting, or for males, it's also the breeding season in the springtime. So there's other things going on other than just trying to kill seals. So what do we have going on? This is how polar bears in 1984 would have seen the world. From January to December, they would have had ice all year long. There's generally the prime feeding period in the springtime, because that's when pups are born to ring seals and bearded seals, and they're much more vulnerable. And then there's a smaller feeding period in the autumn as the ice starts to reconsolidate. With warming, and in parts of the range of polar bears, the bears have this on-land fasting period. And they're extremely well adapted to it. And a normal fasting period of 120 to 150 days doesn't pose huge problems for the population. Some individuals, of course, don't have energy, but of course, others are going to get through it just fine. The problem with global warming is that we've got this extending fasting period, and it's starting to bump into the feeding period in the spring, and it's starting to bump into the feeding period in the autumn. So what does climate change really meant? And I like these things because they just kind of point out the structure on how we think about climate change and polar bears. So we've got warming. We look at altered sea ice. We spend a lot of time analyzing sea ice in my lab. It means that ultimately the changing ice means less food, increased movements, and a longer fast. It just leads to a lower body condition that translates into higher mortality, fewer pregnancies that are successful, and a population decline. So that's the simple story. And this is just a little bit of what it looks like on a nice day. This is from 2019, working out in Hudson Bay. It's a really interesting environment. And of course, I always tell my students to bring Gravol with them, not the fake ginger stuff, but the real stuff. We do a lot of twisting and turning to find a bear like this one. Usually we're tracking them. For those of you that are not yet getting your horizon right, there's actually a seal kill or an old kill just below on that ice pan, just near the bottom of the screen. So that's why we spend our time. When we find seal kills, we collect samples and stuff. Again, a lot of our data and even what we're doing out in the spring is deploying ear tag radios. This female is wearing both an ear tag and a collar as we were piloting. What we're interested in with the collars are some basic parameters. So we can follow their offspring survival, we can follow their movements. And of course, if you look at this female, this was from about a decade ago in Hudson Bay. This female's really running out of energy. You can see her hip bone sticking out. Her cubs are not doing well. They're incredibly lean. You can see this sort of puckered face look on them. Usually cubs have a nice little chubby face, but she's probably stopped lactating. And some of the work we're doing right now with a student in my lab, Aaron Miller, who just defended recently, is looking at these dynamics and what does it mean for cub survival from an energetics perspective. So this is just a bit of data from Hudson Bay to give you a sense of what we get when we have our bears out on the sea ice. And we usually are deploying in collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada, 10 to 15 collars per year. This is just a subsample from 2017. And you can see it's now November. The bears are starting to move northward, part of their migration. Then the ice is forming and they take off. There's some really interesting movement patterns here. Quite often, if you look at them, it looks almost like a ballet or they're choreographed in space. We're now into the midwinter, full ice cover. We're into February. The bears are out over the whole bay. Massive home ranges for these bears. Now we're into March. Fortunately, they're back into an area where we can catch them working from Churchill. And so what you can see is the ice is breaking up. April, May, things are getting more dynamic. But the bears show very high fidelity coming back to the same area in Western Hudson Bay over time. So as this runs out into the summer, the bears come on shore and they all eventually end up somewhere back where they want to be in Western Hudson Bay. From the context of polar bears and energetics, and one of the questions I get with climate change is, won't the bears just become more terrestrial and be more like brown bears or grizzly bears? It's not going to happen. That's not how polar bears evolved. It's not what makes them tick. Your average polar bear has a home range size of about 200,000 square kilometers. That's about a third the size of Alberta. Your average grizzly bear in the high Arctic has a home range of about 1,000 square kilometers. Vastly different life history trajectories. But the deniers like to say, oh, they'll just live on land. But anyways, putting in some of our research into context, this is work that was done by Marie-Augé Mette with Mark Lewis and I. And this is just putting some of the challenges of working in this environment. And it's an incredibly dynamic environment. So you have to think that this is a habitat that's also moving. So this is some work that Marie did. Marie's now a professor of statistics and zoology at UBC. And we're still collaborating on some of these things. But this is a simple sort of perspective. The bear, you get this displacement, but that displacement is actually what the bear walked minus what the ice is doing. And so you have to look at the dynamics of the environment, because especially from an energetics perspective, if you're just sitting on a piece of ice that's drifting, that doesn't cost you any energy at all. But of course, if you're counteracting the drift, you're actually having to put more energy. You just have to walk 5 kilometers against the current or the drift of the ice to stay in one place. So again, it gets more complicated. So when you get down to trying to analyze how much energy is being used, you have to get down to looking at voluntary movement versus the drift. So in all of our analyses now for space, you have to decompose all of your satellite telemetry data to get the active movement of the animal rather than the passive. In these ecosystems as well, this is just a map of wind currents over the Arctic. And this is work that we did with Ron Toganoff, who's now actually a graduate student with Marie-Augé Mette at UBC doing his PhD. And we looked at sort of the foraging ecology of bears, because of course, polar bears are a olfactory predator. Most of their prey are found by sense of smell. So in this context, Ron took those sort of wind maps and looked at the movements of the bears. And we had a nice paper in Scientific Reports looking at their spatial ecology relative to wind. Wind is going to be critical if you find most of your prey by scent. Of course, if you're walking crosswind, you're sampling the whole environment beside you. If you're walking downwind, all you smell is your own butt. If you're walking upwind, you can't really smell anything except what's in front of you in a narrow window. So again, some real interesting complexities in terms of how the bears are moving, in terms of when they move with the wind, And when they're moving crosswind, they tend to move out into the bay. And then we start to see in the winter a lot more crosswind movement. And then basically at breakup, they don't really care. They just kind of drift down and then come back to home. So it's a complex environment. And again, a lot of these sorts of things influence how much energy they're moving or using as they're moving out of the sea ice. Because once they get on land, there is precious little to eat there. Yes, they'll eat berries and some kelp and some eggs, but there's no reliable source of food that would counteract mass loss. This is work that was we did in collaboration with the Manitoba government. They have problem bears around Churchill and they put them into a polar bear jail. So it's a perfect scenario. We can get the weight of a bear going into jail and the weight of the bear coming out of jail. And we know that they're not fed in jail, because if you feed a polar bear in jail, then they like it so much, they'll just come back again and again. We know that for a fact because in 1985, I did feeding trials in the jail, and the bears did. They broke into the jail the following year. We weren't allowed to do that anymore. But anyways, Nick Pilfold led this work. He's now a research scientist with the San Diego Zoo. We continue to work together on polar bears. But one of the things you can see here is your average bear is losing about 1 kilogram of body mass per day on land. Most of that is fat, a little bit of it's protein, but you can get a sense that there's a finite store on each of these bears. And of course, bigger bears with bigger stores will burn more energy, but they also tend to have larger stores. And that's sex specific, reproductive state specific as well. So we did some modeling with that data. And one of the things you can see, we just compare here the upper and lower bounds estimates for adult males and subadult males. And of course, in the red and pink there, the subadult males are much more vulnerable to the duration of that ice-free period. So from an energetics perspective, we know that these young males are going to be a weak link in the system. Adult males can go a lot longer. But once you get beyond about a 200-day ice-free period, we're going to start seeing a larger proportion of the population starving because they just run out of energy. And some work that Mark Lewis and I did with Peter Molnar shows that it's almost an exponential increase as you get out there, because more of the population, you're just going up the normal curve in the distribution of body masses, more and more individuals run out of energy. So we tried to look at this also from a population perspective. And so this was work we did, again, in close association with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Nick Lunn, who's co-located with us on the 11th floor whenever we're allowed back up there. And we just looked at, now we're looking at storage energy in adult males and how much energy do they have on them. And we just looked at this as the date of sea ice breakup. And so one of the things you can see here is that in an early breakup, the bears early breakup, the bears come ashore with much less energy than if it's a late breakup. And there's this translates for all the age and sex classes that we looked at. I've just shown adult males and solitary adult females. So again, you get this idea that date of breakup influences the body condition. And we were interested in this, trying to get it to a more population perspective. And it's not just the breakup that happens this year. In this study, we also showed there's a time lag effect in this population. So it also depends on how long the open water period was the year before. So again, it's a complex system with long time lag effects. We were also trying to bite off what's actually happening in the population. Western Hudson Bay population, where this data is from, is declining in abundance, but it's also declining in body condition. And so what we did here was a nice paper by Amy Johnson, again, following through. We looked at how much energy is in that population over the time frame from the 1980s up to now. And what you can see here is it's sort of dynamic and noisy, but polar bears really don't represent as much energy in that ecosystem as they used to. And it's this combination of condition and abundance. So we're trying to get at some of these questions and we work with some other researchers with Fisheries and Oceans Canada to try to get at this link between bears and the seals as well. Some other work, this is work that was done by Jody Reimer with Mark Lewis and I, looking at some of the behavioral decisions that bears have to make. And what she found was the bears have to really choose about where to eat. So remember, we talked about ice types. Do they go into the fast ice or pack ice? That varies with their reproductive state. So if they have cubs or if they're independent, they can make riskier decisions if you don't have cubs with you. It also depends on your energetic state. And so there's some really interesting dynamics here about changing behavior in the population as well. And so Jody did her work with Mark and I believe she's just accepted a professorship in the United Kingdom. So some of this work was, yeah, do I go to the fast ice? There's lower prey there, but it's less risk for the cubs because we don't have many infanticidal males there. They also don't have to swim as much, and cubs, when they're small, are vulnerable to hypothermia. Or they could go into the active ice and basically risk higher cub mortality, but for higher prey availability. So it's a risk reward sort of scenario. And this work in global change biology showed really, depending on that breakup date and when it's going to happen, the bears should be adjusting to more risky behavior if breakup is coming sooner, because you just got to take that chance. Otherwise, it may impinge on the survival of the female. So again, moving through, and we're getting through a good chunk of the talk now. This is the Western Hudson Bay population. In the 1980s, actually as part of my PhD, I got a good population estimate, about 1,200 bears. Now it's about 800 bears. Part of that decline is associated with climate change. Part of it is that there's still a sustainable harvest in Nunavut out of this population, but it's in decline. And so this brings up some really interesting human bear challenges as well. And we've been doing some work with the Manitoba government, looking at problem bears and what does it mean in that population. We're deploying ear tag radios on bears that get into conflict because, of course, Manitoba moves them out of Churchill and puts them up the coast, which kind of transports them closer to the next community in Nunavut, which is Arviat, and they're having no end of problems with bears. So what we end up with are some really interesting conflicts because communities in Nunavut are seeing more bears in the Western Hudson Bay, whereas we know that the population's actually in decline numerically. It's because the bears are moving somewhat differently, trying to find sea ice. They're also staying longer on land and they're in poorer condition. So there's some interesting dynamics and social challenges in this area. And again, this is work that was done by Sarah Heemskirk in my lab. Sarah was an undergrad and she published this as an undergrad, which is pretty cool. But she took the data from the Polar Bear Alert Program, this human bear conflict program in Churchill, and you can see that the length of the ice-free period, the longer it is, there's this trend towards having more problem bears. It's a noisy system because sometimes there's management policy changes as well that have occurred, but it's a really interesting dynamic about what's going on here. And we just published that a couple of years ago. This is an interesting one as well because it speaks to some of the complexities of what's happening. We know that the population is in decline. And if you look at the data on the human bear conflicts here, it was on a steady rise from the 70s as the population was actually recovering because it was actually quite depressed. The abundance is increasing. There was a dump there. The dump was actually shut down in 2005. But the number of problem bears has actually dropped. So you can see this sort of broken stick model where increase and decrease. So there's a lot of complexity in the system going forward in time. We're still working on some of these questions. So to sort of wrap up in summary, we've done some other work with sea ice modelers that suggest that polar bears should persist to the end of the century. Not in Western Hudson Bay. Our analyses indicate that they'll probably blink out sometime mid-century, but it just depends on the trajectory of the sea ice there. It's not changing as fast as other areas. So we should have bears easily out to the end of this century in the high latitudes. But the only real conservation solution is reducing greenhouse gas production. There's some pretty strong evidence that if we can reduce carbon dioxide concentrations, we'll do better in the long term. So to wrap up, acknowledgements. This is the workhorse of my lab. This is just some of the recent U of A graduate students. I've been really, really lucky, and I think collectively we all are at the U of A to have incredibly strong graduate students coming into our program. And I've been extremely lucky to work with some incredibly talented individuals over time. And it's been great. And then of course, we've got a lot of collaborative efforts in our department as well. And I won't go through those all right now, but it's an amazing cast of characters. This is expensive work. Again, I've been really fortunate by having some excellent research funding over the years, solid base from NSERC, of course, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Bottom line, like most of us, we'll take money from anywhere. We actually had funding from Banrock Station, which is a winemaking company in Australia. So again, thanks for your attention, folks. And I think we're pretty much on time and got a bit of a chance for some questions as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. If you, I'm not sure if you, there you go, perfect. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. What I'd like to do, I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions. If you can use the reactions button to raise your hand, and I'll call on you to ask your question.
I see some random clapping. Maybe it's dog walking time.
No, it's all good. Okay. Okay, I have a question or two. Maybe I'll start. So one of the things I noticed with the way that I guess their head is shaped and whatnot is that their ears seem to be a bit further back. Is that just a consequence of a sort of an elongated skull, or does that play a role in some aspect of their life, their lifestyle?
Yeah, they do have smaller ears than grizzly bears, pretty much as a rule. And one of the basic it's like if you go back to the old biogeographic rules things, it's Allen's rule, right? Small appendages in cold climates. So you see the same thing in Arctic fox, get really tiny ears versus those that live in warmer environments. So yeah, it definitely is. I remember Ian Sterling and I once caught a bear. We called him Dumbo. We never saw him again. But this bear had just whopping huge ears, like probably some atavistic trait, throwback to grizzly ancestor. But we were laughing so hard at this poor bear, we never even took a picture of it. But there must have been some pretty strong selection. It's minus 40 degrees. It's dark. The wind's blowing. Keeping those ears down and well furred, like they're really well furred, not much is going to get in there. Then you also think that when they're swimming, they tend to drop their ears flat, which of course probably reduces the amount of water. Although they can dive, they're not typically diving, but they will go underwater. They can dive for at least 30 seconds to a minute if pushed to. So yeah.
Thank you. Stan.
Andy, I want to go back to the way you started your talk, and you said that all ecology is just basically energy in and out. Is that just because you have apex predator brain, or do you think that actually applies right across the ecological realm?
Well, I thought you taught me that, Stan, as my PhD co-supervisor like 30 years ago. No, I think in part, it's probably just where I've got to in terms of my thinking. And of course, there's a lot of other aspects going on. I mean, there's genetic issues and there's all sorts of other things that we can study. Part of it is probably that it is somewhat more tractable for some of the things that we can collect on the bears. We can see where they go. We can try to estimate what they're killing, their body condition. Yeah, I think that there's elements there that are probably general to a lot of species. I think we are trying to understand what goes in and what comes out and how food affects that. And of course, well, the Klawani study is kind of about that as well. You know, you do feeding trials. I'd love to do feeding trials on bears. We did that once in that holding in the polar bear jail. It's just the government wouldn't let us do any more after that. But because like I say, the bears actually did break into the jail the next year. But I do think it is sort of an equalizing force that we can look at, because we can start to quantify things like reproductive costs and cost of lactation. And right now, one of the really interesting things that we can see is that I think the weak link in the whole reproductive system is lactational transfer. And we're now doing some work in the lab where we're looking at females and their timing of return to the sea ice relative to their body condition and the survival of their cubs. So is that the weak link in the system where the mom stops lactating and then from that point on, the cubs are on their own energetically. And if she doesn't get a kill, that's the sort of the loose part of the system, because cubs are still being produced. But we're not seeing them being recruited to that 1 year class. So that's kind of the interesting thing that, you know, if you went out there and just looked at litter size, there's no change. If you look at reproductive interval, there's not much change. There's a lot of bears coming in having cubs, but they're not being successful in bringing them through to weaning age at 2.5 years.
How are the seals compensating for this decrease in ice? How do they change their life history to deal with that? Since you
Sorry,
said
the seals, was that the question? Sorry.
Yeah, the seals. How do the seals actually cope?
Yeah, we do some work with Steve Ferguson from Fisheries and Oceans in Winnipeg. The problem is seals are way harder to figure out than the bears. So we sort of use proxies. We've done a lot of work in the lab. In particular, I see Vince is online today, but looking at stable isotope work. And so that's been one way we can look at what the bears are eating and how that ecosystem might be changing over time using stable isotopes and other markers, fatty acids. We can see some changes going on. Greg Tiemann, who was a postdoc in my lab, we still work together. He's now at York, but he uses fatty acids, and we can see an increasing signature in Hudson Bay of harbor seals. So the harbor seal population, well, harbor seals don't like ice, but as there's less ice in that system, they're going up. But there's a bit of a mismatch that goes on between polar bears and harbor seals in terms of the timing of pupping and their distribution. So I don't think that's the savior. If it was the savior, we would have polar bears all down the west coast of British Columbia and Alaska and summering in Newfoundland and things, because it just doesn't seem to be. Ring seals generally are thought to be declining in the Arctic. Bearded seals kind of like broken ice, so it's probably not that detrimental to them at this time. But certainly some of the ice conditions that we've seen in the Arctic in recent years for ring seals has not been conducive to successful reproduction. There's no snow on the ice because freeze-up's coming later. You miss that snowfall. The ice forms flatter quite often. You don't get the ridging, you don't get the snow accumulation, you can't build a snow layer. If ring seals pup on the surface of the ice, it's like just like a killing spree for Arctic fox. Birds of prey, gulls will come in and clobber them. But Arctic fox will just clean them up, no question, if they don't have a lair. So, and we've seen that, I've seen that in Svalbard where there's no snow on top. The seals pup on the surface, and the next day you come back and it's just little blood spots, and the seals have been cached by the Arctic fox somewhere on land. So yeah, but ring seals are tough critter to know.
Thanks, Andy. There are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll start with Heather's first. Great talk, Andy. Do polar bears have any ectoparasites such as lice or mites?
You know, I love that because every time I meet a parasitologist, they always say, what about ectoparasites, parasites? And I go, yeah, I'd love to find one. We don't really. And so actually it got to the point, and I've worked with a few parasitologists, but it seems that what happened when polar bears went from a terrestrial environment to a marine environment, they really broke a lot of those host parasite relationships. And they either haven't rebuilt yet, or they just don't exist. They have trichinella, which is of course an internal parasite, but not much more. But the really fun thing was, I had that same sort of question from a parasitologist in Norway, and they said, well, they must have ear mites. They must have some sort of a mite. So we actually cleaned the ears of about 250 bears. We went in there with the Q-tips and did the whole thing, put them in, took them down to the lab, and nothing. And I couldn't get the parasitologist to write it up because there was nothing to say. And I said, well, that is the thing to say, that there was nothing to say. I guess I could go back to doing that, but it's been interesting. They really have very little in the way of parasites, which is really cool because, of course, if you go into ring seals, they're absolutely ridden with parasites, heartworm, roundworms, intestinal worms. You open up a seal and it's just a freak show what's going on in there. You wonder how they actually make a living in that environment. So yeah, there's some really interesting things there, but they really left a lot of the bad stuff behind when they moved out into the oceans.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is from Natasha Hardy. So, really great talk. I'm always curious about the trophic interactions. The seal carcass made me wonder what other predators or scavengers potentially benefit from a carcass that is partially eaten. Or subsequently, do you see more of the carcass being consumed as hunting foraging grounds degrade and the foraging season shortens?
Yeah, bullseye. Tash, you hit it right on. It's actually one of the studies we started a few years ago, just before COVID. And what we've got is, this is some work that we're doing with Nick Pilfold from the San Diego Zoo. And the nice thing about working with San Diego Zoo is they got deep pockets and big donors. So we've just got funding to buy 2 snow machines, and we're going to do some artificial caching of seals out on the ice to look at that relationship between carcasses and scavenger diversity. We know, and I mean, when we're looking for polar bears, we look for birds because there is that community that exploits them. And there's a lot of species that do. But what we're trying to do is quantify it, who's coming in. We thought we could use natural kills, but it's really hard to find them fresh enough. It's probably, to follow on that, it's probably how subadult bears make a living for the first couple of years of their life. We're doing some work on this with the Alaskans, and this is some really interesting work. We're working with our stable isotope data and their data, pooling our samples and theirs, looking at some new Bayesian models with fatty acids and stable isotopes to try to estimate the proportion of meat going into bears versus the proportion of fat, because there is some fractionation there that goes on. This is work that's being led by Karen Rode with US Geological Survey. So it's yeah, I think it's really one of the fun things, these sort of trophic dynamics and the relationship of bears to other bears in the population, but also to other species. In Western Hudson Bay, the main scavengers out on the ice are Arctic fox. They're like a little brother to the polar bears. They just skip around and follow them way out on the ice and pick up on their kills. They're pretty good predators in their own right on pups, but they're the main scavenger. And then the birds move in quite quickly, and it's a really interesting area. I just hope we get back out and can do it. We've got the money to buy 2 new 4-stroke snow machines, or at least San Diego Zoo has them, which means they have to maintain them. I don't.
Thanks, Andy. That's super fascinating. Yeah, that's baffling too, what you said about parasites, ecoparasites in polar bears. I'm pretty familiar with the freak show you talked about in seals from the Southern Hemisphere. So yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, The parasite thing is pretty cool. I worked on grizzly bears in the West Coast up near Bella Coola for a while. And I mean, in the summertime when the bears are, eating salmon and stuff, you walk around in the bush and it looks like somebody sometimes has hung confetti, like, or ticker tape through the bushes, and it's tapeworms that are just kind of strung along. Yeah, grizzly bears are full of parasites, where polar bears are really pretty good. One challenge, and I didn't get into it, with climate change is we are seeing more diseases moving into the Arctic. We're seeing toxoplasmosis in the bears that we think is associated with warming conditions. That's the thing that's in cats, like house cats have it quite commonly. Toxoplasmosis, brucellosis. And there's been some interesting work that's been looking at that. I don't work in disease too much anymore, but I've done some of that work over the time, because when I was in Norway, I was responsible for polar bears, and I was just worried, well, what happens if we have a big die-off of polar bears? We know that, and I've done a lot of work on pollution as well. And there is this interaction between climate change, pollution, immune system function, and disease and parasites. So there's some really interesting complexities that we are involved in to some extent in the lab. So it really is this complex system that's going on. So there's some really interesting things, but yeah, it's not always good news for the bears, but yeah.
Well, so we have one final question here, unless more turn up, but this one's from Evie. So is the loss of ice opening the environment to other marine species, such as other marine predators on the seals? And if so, what impact on the bears does this have?
Yeah, it's there are changes, and they're quite dramatic throughout the Arctic. And so if you look at it, I mean, you take away the sea ice, you just end up with a northern Atlantic and a northern Pacific ecosystem. And we are seeing very strong intrusion of North Atlantic, North Pacific species into higher latitudes. So harp seals from Labrador are going farther north. We're seeing fin whales going farther north, minke whales. So we're seeing a lot of these species migrating northward. I mean, it's going to just fill in with other species. It's just like we've got salmon, Pacific salmon spread across the Arctic now, showing up as far east as Baffin Island. So again, as the conditions change, we're going to see a lot more of these things happen. And from the top predator perspective, we're seeing in the Western Canadian Arctic an almost exponential increase in the sightings of killer whales in these areas. So they're coming regularly now right down into Hudson Bay. Of course, they're not adapted to the presence of sea ice with that big dorsal fin. But there's also been some really interesting work that there's some of these transient dynamics, and that the killer whales are coming in, they're killing bowhead whales, which are an ice-associated whale that don't usually overlap with killer whales. They kill the bowheads. They, of course, eat a bit of them, and then the carcass is left floating around. And in the Eastern Arctic, we're actually seeing, not from my lab, but from Greg Tieman's lab, they're actually seeing a bigger signature of bowhead whales in polar bears, because of course it's this huge bonus of food with a dead whale. And you can put 40, 50, 100 polar bears on a bowhead whale and scavenge for many weeks and do quite well. Again, I think it's one of these transient dynamic things. Eventually the killer whales will come in, clean up the seals. And one of the challenges is that bearded seals and ring seals are pelagic species in the summer. They don't come to shore. So they're sitting ducks out in the ocean waiting for killer whales to come and eat them. Whereas harbor seals, of course, are found much closer to shore, where they can hop up in shallows and get out on rocks if they are preyed upon.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I mean, that's I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. That was fantastic. And again, thank you very much for agreeing to do that, to start us off in January for the first lecture of the Chair's Lecture Series. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month. For now, please join me in thanking Andy, and have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. That was great. Good seeing you all. We're sort of seeing you anyways.
Thanks, Andy.
Take care, folks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andy. That was great. He's gone.